Deep within the slab, buried by earth and neglect, lies a cell of twisted bronze. Inside waits a corpse bound in cold, dark stone. She has long since died, but the ghost of her hate lingers, a memory sustained by fury, waiting for one to wake it. But her cell is not so easy to find, hidden at the end of a maze of tunnels, visible only because time has eaten the prison beyond her cell. Then, one day, the daughter of one of her sisters visits her. Akin in part, pale in nature, but a hunter at heart. She will wake the sinner's memory, and the shade of fury and rage will test her niece in battle. Only when Hornet has proven her worth will the memory relinquish her gift. A chaotic runic blast and the foundational truth of the Citadel's religion. It is based on a lineage of lies. Hello, my name is Mary. I'm a professional archivist and writer, and I am piecing together Pharloom's religious history. If you haven't watched the first 3 videos, you may want to do that before watching this one, as it builds upon the concepts of the previous histories. But if you are really curious to watch this video and don't want to do all the homework, I'd suggest video 3 as a prerequisite. You can still enjoy this video without watching the others, but understand that I may make claims about lore that I covered in a previous video. As always, I am doing this for fun. I enjoy sharing my theories and discussing them with you. Feel free to disagree with me. This is one of the most detailed eras of Pharloom's history, so I divided it up between 3 videos. The last video concluded with a discussion of the first sinner, and this one will pick up where it left off, delving deeper into the Weaver's Citadel, as well as its outposts and religion. The next video will look at the effect it had upon the land outside the city. Like the previous era, I will be examining architecture to help create the timeline as well as the provenance of artifacts. Provenance is often a record of who has owned an artifact, where it came from, etc. This is the most important tool for deciphering the later years of Pharloom's history, as many artifacts have specific information that allows us to piece together the greater religious timeline. For example, in the upper reaches of Bone Bottom, above the old chapel, Hornet can find an ancient effigy of Camora, the Weaver of Healing. It is etched with a prayer written by a pilgrim for their sons. It reads, "Weaver, heal my sons, their fearful hearts, their limbs that shake at the climb to come. We pray, gift but a glimmer of your strength, that when we stand before your divinity, you see bugs shed free of fear." Now there is a sign in Mossholm beneath the Weaver's spire which reads, "Weaver of Pharloom, by grace you warded, by thread you healed. For your favor eternal, we offer our song." Combining this information reveals that the Weaver bound in Mossholm's spire is named Camora. As the Weaver of Healing, she supposedly offered strength to those about to begin their pilgrimage, which likely happened in the 7th era or later. The effigy was found in the remains of a house, implying that the prayer was offered before the pilgrim and their sons went to see Camora and begin their pilgrimage. We will go more into Camora later, as she played a significant role in the history of the Citadel, and though she is spoken of fondly here, she has one of the darkest legacies of all the Weavers. Let's begin with a quick review of what I discussed at the end of my last video. The Weavers put their mother to sleep, likely using some form of counter-resonance. They built the loom to harvest silk from her cocoon. Sometime in this early history, the first Weaver rebelled against the Weavers, for which she was locked in the slab. One of the earliest other sinners in the slab was likely Pious Isamor, a prisoner from the first generation of pilgrims, or choir, who was punished by being cast in metal. Because I will be using Isamor and the first sinner to reconstruct much of the 6th era, I want to begin by discussing 2 concepts related to their identity, which will help us decipher other lore. First, I want to look at a concept of provenance in a bit more detail, particularly when it comes to written text. One of the most important things to understand when it comes to translating text is that the context of the physical document or object that contains the text provides us with information on how to read it. An excellent example of this is the seal on the first sinner's prison and the choral commands found throughout the slab. As I mentioned last time, each follows a specific format, beginning with the prisoner's identity, a number, their sin, punishment, and whether or not they were absolved. The first sinner's identity is the first of the first. As I explained last time, this title refers to her place as the first of the first children, that is, the first of the weaver's silkmaid. There is also a choral command that refers to a prisoner as 12th of the first, who was cast as punishment. Were we simply to put the text side by side, you would think that both descriptions would refer to weavers. Even if we look at the artifacts in isolation, you might conclude the same, and that the first sinner simply received a fancier seal because she was considered more important. But if we look at the places where the seals were found and examine their relationship to each other, we quickly see that they are displayed in two very different places. The choral command is lumped with the sentences of the prisoners of the choir, as they mention sins such as dissonance, irreverence, and illness. This is also a public post for the guards and wardens to access and read as they wish. The seal, however, works with magic to form a lock on a special prison. This prison is in a room normally inaccessible to the guards. Time is the only reason we even know the passage is there, as we can see that it was sealed over at one point in time. This means that the audience who could read the seal was limited to a select group of individuals. Those individuals could only have read it for a short period of time before the cell was completely blocked off. Due to the elaborate nature of the runes, I do believe that the intended readership of the seal were the weavers. The flies have certainly been into the room in later years, as we can see their vomit littering the floor. But originally, the guards at large were not intended to read it. This makes sense, as the weavers would not want anyone to know what the first sinner discovered, because the information, if allowed into the claws of the public, would collapse their entire empire. What does that mean for the text? Well, first of the first was written for the weavers to read, and in their context, they would interpret the prisoner as one of their rank. The choral commands were written and read by those who engaged in the daily activities of the Citadel. This means that most likely, 12th of the first refers to the 12th member or ranking member of the first generation of choir. There is cut content that confirms this. Team Cherry originally made a huge door that appears to have been replaced by the last Heretic door before you reached the first sinner. The fact that they removed this from the game seems to confirm to me that they realized that the weavers did not want anyone to know that one of the first children abandoned their faith. Arguably, it would cast suspicion on the integrity of their godship as a whole if anyone passing by the prison could read the door and discover that one of them had abandoned their position as a god. Thus, it made more sense to hide the prison than for the weavers to have made a spectacle of them. For all these reasons, I believe that 12th of the first refers to a pilgrim, and I concluded that it was Ismor, due to the way his dialogue and other details correspond with the other historical events of the era. I know that some people will disagree with this conclusion, but I also base this on the fact that Team Cherry, especially in this game, has the habit of matching specific lore to specific characters based on a very iconic detail. This is the second concept I want to discuss before beginning the history. I call it parallelism, though the term is usually used to refer to correlations in text, grammar, and sound in prose and poetry. Because this is a video game, the parallelism can exist in more than just the prose or poetry, allowing various experiences to correspond with one another. One distinct place where parallelism appears in the game is regarding the identity and fates of the three conductors. We receive three names throughout the course of the game: Romino, Mizzello, and Ballador. We meet Ballador in the High Halls, and he gives us the conductor's melody. We find a cylinder containing the last surgery of Conductor Mizzello just outside the pit where we battle the Unraveled. And before patch 5 of the game, a broken mantle was left at the entrance to Pharloom, which the bugs carrying Hornet pass by in the game's opening, the same opening that contains the verse for Pharloom's Folly, written by Conductor Romino. This physical proximity between a description of a character and the character or their name is a use of parallelism, helping us connect two separate parts of the lore. It also happens with many of the weavers, both with the weaver effigies and the weave nests. I've already covered Camora, but the effigy of Kilal, Weaver of the Path, which is found in Shellwood, corresponds with the weaver in the spire who gives Hornet the skills she needs to traverse the path. Among the weave nests, Weave Nest Syndril was dedicated to aiding weavers who fled Pharloom and gives Hornet the Silk Speed Inklets. To get the Inklets, you need the ancestral art Swift Step, which you receive from a weaver spire found in the same area. Thus, it is very likely that the name of the weaver in that particular spire was Syndril. By extension of the same parallelism, I believe the weaver who gives Hornet Sharp Dart is Weaver Karn, and the one who gives Hornet Silk Soar is Weaver Absalom. And while it isn't given to us in-game, the Weave Nest on Mount Fae is named Weave Nest Askar in the files. I believe that she is the weaver found in the cauldron who gives you Clawline, as Clawline is the ancestral art needed to reach the top of Mount Fae. There's also a fun little extra level of parallelism with her because the nest is set in ice and her spire is surrounded by fire, hinting again at the types of tools needed to battle the elements of the icy mount. But there is one other important weaver whom we can discover the identity of through parallelism, and that is Atla, the third weaver immortalized through the weaver effigies. The effigy for Atla, when interpreted by Scrounge, reads, "Carving of Atla, weaver of time. A prayer is etched upon it. By grace of your example, and our history held full in mind, our song is yours, as your name is sacred. Weaver Atla, may you be praised, eternal." This prayer implies that Atla was highly revered as a god, and was seen as worthy of song and eternal praise. The effigy is found in the claws of a prisoner, lost in the lower sections of the slab beneath the first sinner's prison. Too weak to make his way back up, he offers the effigy and apologizes to Atla, saying, "Your light, forgive my silence. Too weak to return. I failed you." Little does he know that Atla is a prisoner too, because she is the first sinner. The firstborn of all the weavers, the creator of runes. She is Atla, the sacred one, worthy of the praises of common bugs. We can make this connection not only due to the effigy's proximity to Atla's spire, but because of Weave Nest Atla. The largest and grandest of weave nests was specifically dedicated to rune work and magic. We see this in the artifacts of the nest, the rune setter, Eva, and something else in the room with the rune setter that I think most people miss. More on that later. After battling the first sinner, Hornet writes in the Hunter's Journal that she may have been the first weaver to weave runes. This is a very specific detail to point out, and one that parallels the work being done in Weave Nest Atla. Also, the idea that she was the very first weaver and was considered important by her sisters matches the size of the weave nest, which is the largest and most elaborate in the land. Similarly, Atla's prison is the largest and most grandest in the slab. Now, because Silk Song is a work of fiction, we can recognize that the prisoner worshipping Atla and clinging to her effigy is a purposeful act by Team Cherry that mirrors the other two effigies. Normally, I would never make these connections if I were an archivist working in real life. But parallelism is a way Team Cherry secretly connects and helps us confirm the lore of their ambiguous story. Similarly, this is why I believe that Pious Ismor is the prisoner mentioned in the slab's choral command. We don't see any other pilgrim statues that were made using a cast. All other pilgrim statues were carved out of shell or rock. There are automatons of the leadership triad, but none of them were sinners, nor would they be labeled by such a low number. The clockwork dancers were cast in metal, but from the Green Prince's testimony, it sounds like his partner traveled to the Citadel and traded his life for Verdania's safety, rather than him being arrested and punished by the Citadel's leadership. He also did not join the choir, and thus wouldn't fit the numbering. For all these reasons, I believe that Team Cherry intended for us to connect Pius Isamore, the only pilgrim statue made using a cast, with the hidden command found in the slab. There is still more to discuss about Isamore and Atla, but I'm going to cover it as we move along, as it is now time to officially begin our examination of the reign of the Weavers. In my timeline, the reign of the Weavers began when they put their mother to sleep, and ends when the last Weaver Spire was erected. As always, I could spend forever covering every aspect of every theory, so I'm going to share my timeline of events, why I placed the moments when I did, while at the same time discussing the Weavers' purpose as to how they designed the Citadel of Song. When the Weavers managed to lull their mother to sleep, they had several choices as to what to do next. They could attempt to hide in other lands, but their mother would certainly wake. So, in preparation for a future where they would obtain their freedom, the Weavers descended to ordinary bugs and began the slow twisting of their mother's religious government into a system for their benefit. The Weavers had 3 purposes for this twisting. First, to buy them time to find a way to destroy Silk or else escape to freedom. Second, to erase the memory of their mother and set themselves up as gods of the land. Third, to manipulate the population in becoming their slaves without their understanding. While not without its complications, their mother's government and the land's religious history proved an excellent foundation upon which to begin their reign. Rather than start from scratch, they adopted almost every part of their religion from something that had come before. The trick was to explain away their mother's past, while still maintaining their ties to divinity. The solution was a simple redefining of words. Rather than Silk being a name, Silk became the substance, and the cocoon, the sacred heart of Pharloom's silk. The Weavers were its first children, born of the heart to which all of Pharloom owed its devotion and praise. Just as their mother demanded, so the heart was owed extravagant worship in the form of song. And to maintain that song, the Citadel needed a constant stream of bugs to sing in its choir. In other words, the Citadel needed pilgrims. It is clear from the way events unfolded that it took a bit of time for them to develop the full concept of the Citadel, but they must have come up with the idea rather quickly in order to have begun to build the looming stone structure that would help to keep their mother asleep. First, the Weavers built the loom. This was a spiteful way for them to use their mother's power to keep her entrapped, while allowing themselves to use their own silk for their own purposes. In my last video, a number of people brought up the fact that the Weavers really didn't need to use their mother's silk because they had their own. But I want to point to the Weaver tablet found in Weavenest Merglin. It says, "Sister, spider, sat between salt and stone. Build those tools of brilliant mind imagined. Aid us when our silk has waned." The Weavers were finite producers of silk, and considering how they wanted to focus on their own projects, they would want to use another source to spare themselves the trouble of providing silk for the projects in the Citadel. Remember, the mask maker calls their rule lavish, and I don't think that draining themselves of silk as a particularly lavish lifestyle. The Conductors also use the loom, but I will discuss their story in video 6. It is sometime after the loom that they would have instructed the common bugs they now ruled, thanks to their mother's reign, to begin to build the foundations of the Citadel. It was quite plain, and there was a heavy focus on constructing the underworks, as it originally served as a forge for the city and would have been pivotal to keeping the project on track. While there is no knowing this for certain, I have a feeling that the flies who run the slab likely lived in the region where the Citadel was built. While probably partially due to their fat, the warden flies can survive the frigid temperatures of Mount Fae wearing only metal armor, which makes me inclined to think that, while maybe not native to Mount Fae, they could have lived in the surrounding areas, which are very windswept. Many of the bugs in the moors and swamps are very fly-like, so it would make sense that a group of flies originally lived in the massive cavern. My hypothesis is that the flies may have been a part of the construction crew for the Citadel, which also displaced them when it was built. Whether it be because they felt betrayed by what the Citadel became, or the Weavers simply didn't want to deal with the fact that they were displaced, they condemned the entire cast to work the slab for the rest of their life. While the old penitent claimed it was for some grievous sin, we have to keep in mind that the Weavers could have simply made up some bile water reason to throw them into the slab so they could be the wardens. In fact, considering the authority and freedom that the flies are given in the slab, I wouldn't be surprised if the flies were originally very subservient to the Weavers and, recognizing their obedience to a fault, the Weavers took advantage of that by giving them the most unpleasant responsibilities in the Citadel. To keep up the building of the Citadel, they would have commanded the construction of the deep docks and called the forge bugs to serve them for a holy purpose. I believe that they also constructed more of the walls around far fields during this time. In my first video, I dated them to Era 5, and they could still be a part of that era, but I think it is most likely that they were built in Era 6. It's a bit too much to cover in this video, so I have written up a post and shared it on my Substack. Most importantly, in this time, they constructed the weave nests. I date the weave nests to this part of the timeline because of the silk shades in Weave Nest Atla who say, "Our rooms are silk to bind her tight, to keep us free." Notice how they say to keep us free. This clarifies that the shades were from a time post-Grandmother Silk, when they had already freed themselves from her rule. The reason why the nests are so far away was because, even in her slumber, Silk had the potential to sense them. At the end of Act 2, when Hornet has helped the Caretaker assemble the snare, he specifically says that the god can sense their malicious intentions. This is why the hidden tablet in Weave Nest Atla reads, "This though her gaze escaped, prepare, sisters, weave hope anew, that we might break free this accursed web born of our naive foundation." Because they say that the web was born of their naive foundation, not their mother's, I read the nests as coming after they lulled Silk to slumber and realized that she would not stay asleep forever. And it is sometime here, between when they made the weave nests, but before they had introduced the pilgrimage and completed the Citadel, that the first sinner discovered the truth of their origins and rebelled. I place her here, 1, because she is called the first sinner, so the religion was in its very early stages, but also because of the nature of her spire. For one, the stone is not the same stone found in the slab. It's the same stone found in the cradle. The floor, likewise, matches the floor of the hidden harp room, and the spire appears to have been ripped out of one place and moved to the slab. For that reason, I think that Atla told her sisters what she discovered, and in response, before she could go down and tell other bugs, they immediately ganged up on her and sealed her in a spire. Whether they lured her to the cradle, or she was there when she revealed what she discovered, I don't think that Atla had any opportunity to go anywhere. The fact that the stone matches the cradle is reason alone for me to believe that she was handled with the utmost secrecy. If this is the case, why does she have a Weaver effigy? The Weaver effigies, from the way they are written, are circa Era 7 after the Weavers were sealed in spires. So when did the doctrine of her being the Weaver of Time begin? Well, before her discovery and before the formal introduction of the Citadel, it is likely that she was revered as a deity like the rest of her sisters. When she was locked away, because none of the pilgrims could hear Atla's true story without exposing the truth of the Weavers, Atla's life was once again turned into a lie, this time by her sisters. They probably told the common bugs that she had died, which was true, and turned her into a model for their proselytes. But why was Atla called the Weaver of Time? Was it a fancy title or something more? I believe there is an answer, but it is one of the more hidden pieces of lore. In the most basic sense, I think that the term referred to her being a historian. Besides her skills in weaving runes, she likely kept history, as Weaveness Atla also has a huge room covered in hundreds of scrolls. And yes, this does mean that Atla was kind of an archivist, so big fan. But that's not the only reason why I think she earned the title. When Hornet returns from the Abyss and tells the shaman about the state of Silk, she suggests retrieving the Everbloom from her memory as a means to quell the void. The caretaker asks if such a thing can be done, to which Hornet replies, "For another bug, no, but I am weaver enough to attempt it. In the distant past I knew the flower. My thread still holds its faint memory. If the Everbloom was grasped strongly enough within my silk, it could be made to manifest." Notice how Hornet clearly knows that she, as a weaver, has the potential to traverse memories. This means that she had knowledge of this magic long before she came to Pharloom. While it could have been discovered by the weavers living in Deep Nest, I believe it was discovered even earlier, back in the days when the weavers still lived in Pharloom. And the weaver who likely discovered that they could traverse memories, and thus travel back in time, was Atla. This would explain why the first sinner had knowledge of the moment of her creation, sometime after her mother was put to sleep, perhaps in attempts to search the past for a hint of her mother's weakness. Atla traveled to the past, her past, and discovered the truth of who and what the weavers were. This ability to travel through time by accessing memories fits perfectly within the religious ideas present in Pharloom, especially when you consider the existence of chapels. It also explains how Atlas served as a god to the citizens of the land. Like her, they were to remember their history, at least the one invented by the weavers, and live in accordance with this memory. It is likely that some of the research regarding memory happened in Mount Fae, as the mountain is filled with memory crystals and creatures with similar abilities. I believe that it played a role in Atla discovering the truth, and this isn't as far-fetched as you might think. The main structures on Mount Fae were built in the time of the weavers, likely when the initial construction on the Citadel was being done. But at a later point in Era 6, they walled up a passage in Mount Fae leading to a certain section of their weave nest. That part of the weave nest is where Hornet obtains the memory crystal. Now there is no knowing if Atla is the reason why they might have abandoned studying memory crystals, but I think that they blocked it up so common bugs could not find the crystals and potentially learn the truth about Silk, the weavers, and the reality of the Citadel. But most importantly, understanding this potential part of Atla's story reveals a particularly damning piece of information about the other weavers. If Atla was the keeper of history, and they knew she could traverse memories, they would then know she was telling the truth about their origins. Imprisoning their sister and hiding history, then, was a way for them to remain as gods over other bugs. Just like their mother, they would rather be loved and adored under the pretense of a lie than be honest and vulnerable with those beneath them. Because the room of the first sinner matches the architecture of the slab, yet the rest of the slab was built to hide the chamber, I suspect it was made first to house the first sinner, and the rest of the slab was built up around it. There are other hidden cells as well, though they seem created through cave-ins and changes to the prison over time. Of course, the existence of the prison before the creation of Pius Isamor reveals a very specific detail about what the Citadel looked like at this time. Last time I mentioned how Pius Isamor described the Citadel as simple stone. However, the prison, which was one of the least holiest places, is not only stone, but contains some metal fixtures and iconography, even in the prison with the first sinner. So some of the gilding existed in the time of the weavers. What I believe Pius Isamor's testimony means then is that the Citadel had ungilded walls. Metal was used in fixtures, and in the cradle was used to gild the floor. We can be pretty sure that the gilding happened in the time of the weavers, because the spools sit atop the gilded floors, as well as the hundreds of corpses of bugs the weavers consumed while watching over the cocoon. These corpses may have been disobedient pilgrims, but let's face it, they didn't need to be bad for the weavers to decide to eat them. The weavers just had to be hungry. Another likely possibility is that they were villagers from the unnamed town at the surface. The silk memory of the lone bug specifically says that the weavers lured down the residents. If those residents were not used as builders, they were certainly used as snacks. As a quick aside, the memory itself is very unusual, as the bug was alive in the time of the weavers, yet the weavers weren't inserting silk into just any bug they met. I will discuss the white word later, but they must have visited the village in person and left enough silk to form a limited trace memory, as the other bugs on the surface do not respond to the needlein at all. But back to the Citadel. From the elaborate nature of the gilding on the floor and the description by Pius Isamore, it seems that metal iconography was used in structural supports, and that gilding was reserved for the most holiest places. Mount Fae is a pretty good time capsule of what the Citadel looked like during the reign of the Weavers. From the looks of it, the Citadel portion of construction either served as a means to reach the mask maker, or possibly to help transport workers up Mount Fae to help the Weavers construct their nest. Perhaps it was used as both. Because of the wall blocking off the passage to the memory crystal, it was clearly altered at some other point after its initial construction, so it may have served two different purposes throughout the 6th era. The carriages may have also been added in the 7th, so it is a bit difficult to discern all that the Citadel bugs did on Mount Fae. I'm curious to hear your theories, and I will share a bit more of mine when I discuss Era 7. While the Citadel was being constructed by common bugs, along with the slab, the Weavers were constructing the doctrine and system by which to keep their mother caged. Originally, I heavily questioned whether or not the Weavers made the judges, bell shrines, and the bell benches. A significant reason why I doubted this was because of the sentinels, who were built to essentially ensure that a steady stream of pilgrims entered the Citadel at all times. This seemed to contradict the idea of a judge who would smash them on the doorstep. Pius Isamore's description of the city as bare stone also confused me, as the bell shrines are quite fancy. I originally attributed the system to the conductors as a way for them to gather and hoard their wealth. In my original theory, the judges served as a means to minimize the new number of pilgrims entering the Citadel, so they wouldn't have to share. Likewise, I thought that the core was a way for them to automate their duties of the choir, basically turning the Citadel into a massive resort. However, as I researched the possibility of this theory, I discovered the existence of a single artifact that completely changed my approach to this era. This is something that regularly happens in archiving. You believe history unfolded one way, but one detail makes you shift timelines or rearrange how you believe events unfolded. This happens in science as well, where a working theory fits the evidence so well, and yet it turns out to be completely wrong. A great historical example of this was the idea of geocentrism, the theory that the universe revolved around the Earth. It was accepted for years, not because the church restrained science as some historians claim. The truth is that the models scientists had come up with to chart an Earth-centric universe were so accurate at predicting the movements of stars and planets, it was basically considered fact. It wasn't until a suitable enough alternative was offered and enough evidence was gathered that heliocentrism, the idea that the Earth revolves around the Sun, eventually took its place. Which leads me to a bit of a secret about academics, particularly about history and science. We're all just making educated guesses. While there are certain things in history we can be sure of with plenty of documentation, I don't want to give the false impression that we can't actually discover the truth. The thing is that the further you go into the past, the more likely someone's guess is to be wrong. Whether you work in history or science, you need to be aware that at any time, someone can find something that can alter your frame of reference and require you to drastically change your interpretation. Even theories with an incredible amount of supporting evidence can be proven factually wrong. The only issue being if people are willing enough to consider it. So would you like to know the artifact I discovered? It's hard to see, almost missable. But in the room where you find the snare setter and weave nest Atla, you can see a bell, similar to the ones found in the bell shrines with a rune over it. The rune was featured in the original Silksong trailer when the bell shrines rang, but in the released version of the game, only appears over the bell in Atla. This explains why the bells end with a burst of soul-like light after they are rung. I will talk a bit more about the bell and the shrine in my next video. Beyond the old trailer, there is tons of cut content in the game and details and interviews that tied the weavers to the shrines and bellways, implying that they had a magical hold over Silk. However, since so much related content was cut or changed, I couldn't use it to confirm that the bell shrines were enchanted and made by the weavers. The cut content of the Coral Gorge is a great example of why. Sometimes Team Cherry makes cuts because of changes to story and lore. So I needed to find a solid piece of evidence in-game that the weavers made these parts of the Citadel, and this bell is that evidence. Finding the bell not only helped me build my timeline of the era, it helped me understand the purpose for the Citadel and the religion the weavers created. So with that in mind, are you ready for the absolutely non-infuriating history of the reign of the weavers? You are? Well, grab yourself a stein of vintage nectar or a bottle of flea brew if that's your thing, while I detail how and why the weavers made the Citadel the way they did. In my essay on Hornet's identity, I said that the weavers subjugated the common bug. But the truth is that they did not only subjugate, they indoctrinated, judged, rewarded, punished, manipulated, sifted, and parsed the common bugs of Pharloom. Long before the creation of the Cogwork Core, or the birth of its inception, the weavers transformed Pharloom itself into a massive eternal music box run on the oblivious suffering of the common bug, all for the sake of their own safety, comfort, and luxury. Let's begin with a review of the Pilgrims' Doctrine. The Pilgrims were expected to travel to the Citadel from Bone Bottom, without weapons, while dressed in rags. Along the way, they were to ring the bells of the bell shrines, creating a constant stream of enchanted music. The last leg of their journey would be the Blasted Steps, where they would be judged whether or not they were worthy to enter the Citadel. These judgments were likely based on the 3 core sins of the slab, as well as those who failed to follow the Pilgrims' rules of poverty. So anyone who appeared lazy, insincere, unholy, or greedy would have been beaten to death on the steps. And by greedy, I mean those who had not subjugated themselves to as low a standard of poverty as Doctrine demanded. In addition, along the Pilgrims Path we can find the iconography of the Weeping Pilgrims. The iconography seems associated with death, as it appears in the Wanderer's Chapel, a broken patch in the entrance of Far Fields, a few places in Shellwood, and along the Blasted Steps. The Weeping Pilgrim iconography further intimidated the pilgrims into obedience and served as a precursor to the end of their journey, where they would face the last judge, whose face is marked by the same weeping iconography. Now, are the Weeping Pilgrims evidence of the long-standing influence of the Void Cult over Pharloom's religious psyche? Maybe, but probably not. At first, I completely believed that the use of tears was a religious icon carried over from the first era. In Hollow Knight, we see a number of bugs who may have been killed by Void and have it draining from their eyes. However, the tears show up on most bug corpses, both in Pharloom and Hollow Nest, regardless of how close they are to the abyss. This is probably because their insides are decomposing and leaking out. Thus, I don't think that this is void, but a biological symbol of sorrow and death. The Last Judge is the last part of the journey to feature the tier iconography, so it seems that part of the statue's purpose was to serve as a precursor to that final judgment. Although I initially thought that the Last Judge was an illogical choice by the Weavers, I later realized why she exists. The gate requires a song to open, requiring pilgrims to either sing or play music. In addition to catching any sinners the other judges had missed, the Last Judge was likely the Weavers' way of determining who was a good enough singer to join the choir. One prisoner in the slab was condemned for dissonance, which could be interpreted as singing off-key or playing an instrument incorrectly, maybe going off on an unscripted guitar solo. So we know that being a poor singer or musician was considered a sin. It was all a part of ensuring the Citadel produced the correct resonance to maintain the enchantment. By the way, I have my full theory on the resonance and how the music worked in my last video. The entire Pilgrim's journey was a cruel mechanism used by the Weavers to ensure that only the strongest, most sincere, musically talented pilgrims made it into the Citadel. Those who rebelled, were physically weak, or desired anything more than scarcity, were eliminated not just from the Citadel, but from the land itself. Those who survived the journey were judged one last time upon entry. The entrance room is literally a set of giant scales, and those who were able to ascend would enter the choir, and those who did not were assigned to work the underworks. Before I move on to discuss the Citadel, I want to talk about the Pilgrims Path and take one last look at the Black Pillars, particularly in the Blasted Steps. One of the most predominant icons within the Weaver's religion is that of a pilgrim holding an offering plate. It is first seen in Pilgrim Issamore, but was also built along the pathways to the Citadel. While there are points where the directions become hazy, if one starts walking at Bone Bottom, you can follow a trail of posts and walls with the Citadel's iconography all the way up to the city. There is an excellent stretch of trail in the Blasted Steps from the home of the Pinstress to the Conchfly Arena that displays what the path looked like and how they built it into the existing black pillars to help it appear more ancient. As a quick aside, I believe the pilgrimage is where the stacked stones in the marrow come from. At first I thought that they might be a form of headstone or grave marker, but because we also find the traditional wood and metal scrap grave markers in the marrow, the stones probably do not mark burial sites. I think it more likely that the stacking of stones was practiced by pilgrims meditating on their fragility and finiteness in the presence of Pharloom's foundational bones. The path through the marrow begins with a religious prompt for pilgrims to humble themselves, so this was likely a part of that practice. The marrow is also the only portion of the path, besides the Blasted Steps, to receive any sort of prompt for pilgrims, so it would explain why the stone stacks are only found in that area. The path was built either just before the first pilgrimage, so predating Pious Issamore, or was built after Pious Issamore was cast. I think that the latter is a little more likely, as the first pilgrimage was probably a bit of a test run. The path was likely constructed to ensure that the pilgrims did not get lost and ensured that they passed through all the bell shrines. I will go more into the nature of the path and how it functioned in later videos, but right now I want to look at how the path was built into the pre-existing architecture, specifically the ancient black pillars. It is very common in human history for people to build upon what is already there. This could be something as simple as adding a room to a house, or as complex as rebuilding an entire city when the former was burned to the ground. When I study the pillars as in-world artifacts, I see plenty of evidence of this being what the Weavers did. They utilize already existing structures and added to places where it was worn and broken, or in gaps to give the appearance of their structures being older. This may have been one way that the weavers tried to make their religion appear ancient and true. However, this plan wasn't consistent. If you look at the right black pillar in the room above the Wormway's entrance, you will notice that the pillar is broken and added to with a brick and brass platform. That style of platform matches the stonework of the Pilgrims Path and makes sense as a means to help any wandering pilgrims or Citadel bugs get out of the Wormways. There are various other places where the weavers clearly built into or added atop ruined pillars, so it is hard to say how much the weavers tried to deceive through their use of architecture and what was used as a structural shortcut to build their empire. But I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge that, as a player, there are times when the black pillars and the blasted steps seem incredibly convenient for the Citadel's purposes. The large shelters where you often find carriages are quite handy for the traversal through the wasteland. While in-game, they could have existed when the area flowed with water and was covered with coral, they better fit the gameplay of the windswept region. If you browse older versions of the area through the map drafts provided by Team Cherry, these large shelters do not appear to have existed in early drafts. This does seem to imply that they were added as rest points for players as they traversed the blasted steps. However, it is undeniable that in later drafts, they also seem to have used the black pillars in ways that would date their existence to before the Citadel's rise. Examples of this include the broken pillars and coral platforms in the sands of Karak, as I discussed in Video 2. The Wisp Thicket has its own uniquely labeled black pillars, which are broken in areas to make room for the Citadel's own architecture, which also appears to have been added in later drafts. In some cases, Team Cherry certainly added black pillars to the world to improve gameplay, but the majority of the time, their placement is consistent with having existed before the Old Kingdoms, which makes me believe that it was Team Cherry's intent for us to interpret it that way. Now back to the Grand Gate. It is hard to say whether or not the scales or elevator were as fancy when the weavers first had them built, though the adornments of the elevator shaft are comparable to the slab. Remember, the Citadel was built up in 4 phases. The limited metalwork that adorned the second phase of the Citadel implies that the deep docks were built during this time. Hornet describes the docks as being an outpost of the Citadel, built to mine for ore and materials. The limited metalwork of the architecture of the slab and the cradle seems to imply that the docks had not yet produced much gold. Bronze, iron, and some brass appear to be the main metals used in this time, and we can confirm this when exploring the very edges of the Citadel. Great screws, similar to those found around the first Sinner's Prison, bind the outer foundations of the Citadel to the natural strata. As we move to later eras, we will see that the metalcraft improves and increases as the docks grow into the outpost Hornet visits. In fact, like the Citadel, the deep docks appear to have been mostly stone in the 6th era, as we can glimpse the original stone wall behind the bench just outside the Forge Daughter's forge. Besides ore, the deep docks provided the Citadel with flintstone, the heat-retaining rock that would allow them to heat their own forges. Those forges were located in the underworks. Before we get into what the underworks looked like under the weavers, we need to jump ahead. While I will discuss it in detail in a later video, the 3rd phase of the Citadel's construction was the introduction of pipes as passages for steam and the terminus. This happened in the rule of the Conductors. Part of the steam also came from gears and the exhaust created through running the cogwork core. This doesn't mean that there was not pollution under the weavers. There was a lot, but the Citadel hit its industrial boom in the next era. Because of this, we can determine that the underworks most likely did not have gears, but was focused on construction and forging. Internally, Loam is called the Old Cogwork, and from his room being attached by pipes, it appears to be an addition to the weavers' underworks, and thus circa the 7th or 8th era. Tools such as the delver's drill would have been common tools in the era of the weavers, and the underworkers would have been the ones interacting with what existed of the cauldron. In fact, there is a tunnel beneath the cauldron that appears to be the weaver's version of the underworks pipes, as it has minimal metal fixtures, but not the smooth, dark walls seen in later eras. Because the confessional is in the dark pipes, we can date that as an addition from later eras. And, along with that, I'm going to remove the toll benches from the weavers as well. The entrance room with the first 2 toll benches feature Pilgrims Path statues that are cowled by metal in the present day. Those metal cowls are also a product of future leadership. While the underworks were indeed a place where the weavers sifted pilgrims and put the weakest and unworthy, it probably wasn't too different from the coral chambers. Let's review Isamore's charge to the pilgrims.
Pilgrim, cast aside those many sinful hopes for rest and reward. Remain pure within our midst. Ask for nothing. See the citadel's simple stone, bare and unadorned. See how plain our garb, how sparse our meal. Know that excess is sin. Stay vigilant always, for those wretched pilgrims dare relent to their base desires. Left unpunished, they thin our pure chorus with their seductive sin. It will spread like flame.
Notice that he tells them not to hope for rest and reward, and ask for nothing. Upon arrival, the pilgrims were given a simple sash of clothing, enough food to live on, and were expected to work without rest and no pay. This is why I'm not sure if the benches in the underworks existed. I don't think that the pilgrims had a regular stipend to spend. In the upper citadel, amenities like the terminus did not exist, and neither did the map dispensers, as the model of the citadel inside features the massive dark pipes added in later eras. From the words of Isamore, it seems that the citadel's government provided just enough necessities to keep the bugs alive. Whether sent to the underworks or the choir, all pilgrims were subjected to scarcity and were taught to accept poverty as piety. It was state-sponsored slavery disguised as pious welfare. Pilgrims were told that they were all equal and all family, and to a degree, they were. However, just because they were told not to expect a reward did not mean that they never received any. While the weavers may not have distributed a salary, they probably rewarded bugs as they saw fit. Wanting to be free to live as they wished, the weavers took note of particularly faithful pilgrims and rewarded them with a bit of money, food, or power, creating allies and driving others to strive for similar attention. This is probably how the weavers built the structure of the church. Just like they took disobedient flies and made them run the slab, so they took obedient bugs and placed them in positions of honor. Starting with a simple choir, they sifted and rearranged members into a greater administrative system. This is eventually how the conductors were chosen to rule, as Ballador admits that he and the other conductors took the mantle greedily. It was all part of a grander system, a great web, in which to trap the bugs of Pharloom into maintaining their mother's cage. But let's step out of the citadel for a moment and examine the bell shrines, bell benches, and the bellways. We've already seen the evidence that the weavers made the bell shrines, likely for the purpose of helping to keep their mother asleep through frequent ringings. However, the bell in Weave Nest is very plain, and the current bells are more elaborate. In Act 3, a boulder has broken the first shrine in Songclave and exposed that, like the rest of the citadel, it was made of gilded stone. However, I'm not convinced that the shrine wasn't gilded when it was first built, as we see plenty of use of bronze and brass in places like the Slab and Mount Fay. The citadel may have added some details to it later, but for the most part, I suspect that the bell shrines look the same way they did when they were built by the weavers. The other bell shrines share the appearance of the first shrine, even down to the gilded floors, which match the floors found throughout the cradle. While the style of the gilded floors appear beneath certain items we can date to other eras, such as the terminus and the map dispensers. In this case, it is further evidence that the weavers made the enchanted bells and bench mechanism. Because the bell shrine benches match the bell benches, it would make sense that the weavers created them, though I am not completely sure. The bells on the benches are planar, and thus closer to what we see in Weave Nest Atla, and the bench matches those found in the bell shrine. But the contraption as a whole feels a bit excessive for the rest of the era. The bench obviously functions as a way to tax and train the pilgrims to give up their wealth for the Citadel, though whether it was made by the weavers, conductors, or a combination of the two is unclear. The bellways, on the other hand, were certainly created by the weavers, and by extension, the foundations of Belhart. In the underworks, if we head east out of the room with the delving drill, we come to a pipe and the large bellway bell that is a part of the wisp thicket. The pipe is broken open from the inside, and you can see that it originally ended before the bell. This tells me that the dark pipes were built after the bellways. In addition, the streets of Belhart are gilded with the same design as the floor of the cradle. The town serves as a central hub for the bell veins, which spread throughout Pharloom like a massive cardiovascular system. It is essentially a giant instrument played whenever anyone uses it for travel. It may have been enchanted, which is why Silk has snared the bell beast in modern times. Another small detail of the bellways that points to the weavers is that they open to the tune of a harp. By using Silk to work as the lock, it would allow weavers who wanted to use the ways to bypass the tolls when members of the church or those doing official business would have to pay. We know from the fearful pilgrim Hornet meets in Bell Bottom Station that it would be a sin for pilgrims to use the transportation, which corresponds with the weaver's intentions for the pilgrimage to pass through the bell shrines. In addition, the fearful pilgrim mentions that their ancestors once traveled the bellways in gilded carriages. This is also true, as we can find gilded carriages scattered throughout the path in modern times. The high cost meant only officials in the church could ever hope to ride the bellways, preventing sneaky pilgrims from cutting corners. Belhart, then, likely served as another central instrument where the residents who aided the pilgrims created music as they went about their day. We know that the bells were produced by the Citadel, as we can see plenty of extras throughout the upper city and underworks. Meanwhile, there are very few bells in the deep docks. Most function as helmets or means of protection, such as the warding bells. Just like how the first shrine was built in the Citadel and the other bell shrines after, it is likely that the bellways were built from the Citadel downward and out, starting with the Grand Bellway and Belhart. Considering that a bell shrine exists in Belhart, it is likely that the two were constructed alongside one another. The fact that there is a fancy bronze gilding beneath it all also makes me think that the shrines were covered in bronze from the very beginning. In fact, this finery might be why the pilgrims were told not to expect a reward, and were told to admire the simplicity of the Citadel's bare stone. The elaborate metalwork may have been used to draw bugs up to the city in hopes of wealth and reward, serving as another strand of the weaver's elaborate web. Now, some commenters brought up that the metal foundations of Belhart do not feature any Citadel iconography, which is very true. Instead of a cocoon, we see bells. This could mean that the foundations were built beforehand, possibly by forge pugs. Some theorize that it might have been a forge home before the Citadel took over. However, the Bell Hermit says that the permanent residents of Belhart were pilgrims too scared to continue onward, and that the settlement was born from indolence. And the use of the bell iconography, rather than the cocoon, doesn't mean that the structure wasn't built by the Citadel. The bell shrines bear no cocoon iconography, despite being built by the weavers for the Citadel. Thus, I lean on the side that the Citadel built Belhart from its very foundations outward. The fearful pilgrim says that their ancestors built the bellways, and when we consider that the original underworks likely served as a form of a forge, I think it most likely that the bellways were constructed by the same bugs who built the Citadel, and perhaps the earliest bugs of the Underworks. Whether or not the Weavers accepted the Pilgrims' excuses to stay in town and help others is unclear, but it is undeniable that in later eras the Conductors saw no issues with it. So when I say that the Weavers intended to use the residents to play bells, the residents were actually the Pilgrims who temporarily stopped to rest on their journey. As the Citadel of Song was brought into being, the Weavers continued to make weapons to destroy their mother. This included Eva, who was probably made at an earlier point in the timeline, as she can recall her mother's making the snare setter. As the system became more self-sustaining, Sindril would have helped other Weavers flee Pharloom so they can enjoy their newfound freedom. While not explicitly stated, I believe that they also departed for the purpose of trying to create a Weaver hybrid who would overthrow their mother. I base this partially on Hera's insistence on having Hornet with the Pale King, and on the locations where Silk retrieves the Weaver spawn. It seems that the Weavers sought out other powerful groups of bugs in order to produce a savior. Some went to the Steel Clan and sought the help of the Steel Masters. I hypothesized last time that the land west of the Karak is what came to be called the Sand Sea Wastes. Because the Karak held up longest against their mother, they might have gone in search of their tribe's origin in order to harness that strength. It's hard to know what the Black Barons are, but there is a chance that the Black Barons may be associated with creatures such as the Black Worm that Ogrim speaks about battling back in Hollow Knight. If that is the case, it would mean that the Weavers may have sought the power of worms when seeking out a way to destroy their mother. We have covered most of the Citadel and the outposts built in the time of the Weavers, except one. I want to discuss Camora, the Weaver of Healing. The sign beneath her spire reads, "Weaver of Pharloom, by grace you warded, by thread you healed. For your favor, eternal, we offer our song." When Hornet visits the spire, Camora gifts her with the ancestral skill Silk Spear. While a seemingly innocent and useful blessing, little does Hornet realize that she has bound herself to one of the most horrifying symbols of Pharloom's oppression. When pilgrims entered the Citadel and were greeted by Izamor, a few steps beyond loomed a dark doorway. Above that doorway hung a circular sign, adorned with the icon of a spearhead. It was here that some would receive healing balms, and when Silk could no longer heal them, they were converted to silk flies to power lights and inventions. These brutal operations were performed using needles, shears, and great spears which wielded the silks entering the bug's core, a process discovered by the Weaver of Healing herself. Weaver of Pharloom, by grace you warded, by thread you healed. For your favor, eternal, we offer our song. Camora was the founder of the White Ward and the Weaver who introduced silk into mortal bugs. It was most likely she who created the silk siphon, upon which hundreds of thousands of bugs would be transformed into glowing flies, eternal slaves for the Weaver's grand cage. It was her discoveries that paved the way for the creation of Pious Izamor, the architects, and other automatons. With the exception of Hera and Hornet, no other Weaver affected the trajectory of Pharloom more than Camora. Now, under Camora, the White Word did not look as it does in Hornet's time. There are too many pipes and other excessive details that date most of its structure to later eras. I do not think that Camora granted many bugs with eternal life, and instead focused on keeping bugs healthy and running until they were too worn out to work any longer. This is consistent with the oath of the White Word. While song must be sung, none may falter. Infirmity, sickness, death, all are banished from our citadel. By the way, as a chronically ill person, this is probably one of the most terrifying parts of Pharloom's lore. The silk siphon existed, as Pious Izamor appears to be run by silk flies, so we can assume that most early bugs were used to make lights and other practical tools around the Citadel after their death. Yet I believe that Camora did introduce the concept of using silk for immortality. The conductors appear to have been groomed by weavers for their position as leaders. Food was only a necessity in the Citadel, but their large bulk shows that they received an additional portion. In a similar way, I suspect that Camora inserted silk into their shells to ensure that they would be able to carry out their responsibilities for longer than their natural lifespan. She would have also trained the surgeons to use silk, though I believe that its wider use among the pilgrims happened after her death. But I believe that Camora and her silk siphon had one other impact, and that was on the fate of the weavers. In the cradle, we find several cages of supposed weavers or weaver spawn, yet we see no corpses. Neither widow nor silk seem capable of binding them in their current state, so I believe that they were likely converted into silk flies. This could also explain why we see no corpses of the weavers who supposedly returned from Hollow Nest. Even though they were viewed as gods when they left, the doctrine and attitudes surrounding them changed after they fled, as I will discuss in later videos. If or when they returned, they would have stayed at the outskirts of Pharloom, out of their mother's sight. However, access to haunted bugs expanded Silk's reach, and she would have used them to capture her returned daughters. One reason why I believe these events are possible is due to the behavior of the silk flies Hornet finds throughout her journey. Yes, Lace conducts some of them. Yes, they normally seem to gather around corpses. But when we observe them around the Sentinels, or even Pious Ismore, it seems that the silk flies retain some element of past memories and individual will. In the room where we fight the Sentinel, there are 4 silk flies, which match the 4 we see in the background. There are a couple of cases where silk flies guide Hornet off the path to the Citadel towards the Weaver Spires. While the silk flies who lead Hornet along the general path to Silk are probably conducted by Lace, the spires have always confused me, as no one knew about the Weavers' plan to raise up a savior except the original Weavers and the conductors. It doesn't seem that Lace, at least not initially, knew that Hornet could bind the spires, which makes me think that the silk flies who guide Hornet to them might have been the old Weavers. Even if the Weavers did not return from Hollow Nest, I still believe that the captured Weaver spawn were converted into silk flies. I think that it best explains why we find no corpses of the Weaver spawn who were imprisoned in the cradle. Despite all the time and effort poured into the Citadel, the Weavers eventually realized that their own lives were too short to invent a permanent solution. When those who remained had exhausted all of their options to defeat Silk, they decided to turn the Citadel over to others. This is when they chose the threefold leadership and handed over responsibility of the Citadel to ensure that those who fled could have a chance to live full lives of freedom. Conductor Ballador says that they received the mantles from the fading Weavers, heavily implying that they were either dying or abandoning Pharloom when they chose them to rule. Considering that Pious Ismore was likely one of the earliest sinners in the slab, very shortly after the first Weaver, this likely means that the choirs existed long before the conductors came to be. Instead, the Weavers would have originally led them in song. This might sound like a bit of a stretch, but when you look at the threefold leadership, you can see that each position was made to replace the Weavers, each taking on a responsibility that allowed for preserving Pharloom eternal. The conductors took over the management of the resonance and sound. The architect was a way to maintain the industrial development of the Citadel in their absence, serving as a sort of scientific branch of the church. The Vault Keepers kept the history, in some ways taking on the role that Atla would have held among the Weavers. Like the conductors, I also date the first architect to the end of the 6th era, because of what the 12th architect says when they see Hornet with the ruined tool. An architect's work owes much to the art of the first children. they set expert standard for the tools and talents of Pharloom Eternal. To me, this sounds much like how Ballador describes his assignment at the end of the Weaver's reign. The 12th Architect speaks of the first children setting standards, but not about working alongside them. Although some of her memory has been eaten by time, it is obvious that she is trying to imitate their forms rather than replicating something she was explicitly taught. This makes sense as the Weavers had no need for an architect, being entirely efficient with their own inventions and runes. Taking these testimonies into account reveals 3 distinct periods within the reign of the Weavers. The first period involved the construction of the Citadel, the Weave Nests, and the Deep Docks. This is when the Citadel of Song and its system was invented. This period ended sometime around the First Sinner's Rebellion. The second period was when the Citadel of Song and its religion was formally introduced. It was managed by a collection of weavers whom I shall discuss a little later. Ismor would have joined the Citadel at the start of this period and had been punished by the Weavers shortly afterward. While the Citadel allowed the Weavers to lavish in their rule, attempts continued to find a way to overthrow their mother. Across these first 2 periods, many of the Weavers fled Pharloom. I suspect that the majority fled in the Second Era, but it is more than possible that some fled sooner. The third period is when the only Weavers left in Pharloom were those who were running the Citadel, or had helped the last of the other Weavers flee. It is at this time, when the Weavers were fading, that they decided to create the threefold leadership. This is the shortest period of the 6th Era, as the Weavers would have lived a short time before sealing themselves in spires. The threefold leadership was intended to preserve Pharloom eternally, under the guise that some form of salvation would come to common bugs if they maintained the song. It is unclear what exactly this meant to the pilgrims and members of the choir, but for the Weavers, this was probably the only honest piece of doctrine they ever made. For as the remaining Weavers in Pharloom aged, they finally admitted that their salvation would need to come from the lands beyond, where their sisters had traveled. There is one more important Weaver I have to discuss, and that is Widow. There are 3 main theories as to the lore of Widow, and at different points of time I have held all 3. The first is that she is the Weaver spawn staked to service, mentioned in the cradle. I held this for a long time because of the metal gem on her chest, present on several of her cut sprites, but not in the harp scene. Because she shares the same hips, but not the gem, she could be seen as a descendant of that harp player, having obtained that memory through an exchange of silk. There's also the parallelism between her being in the cradle and matching the description of being staked to service. I'm not going to spend any more time discussing this theory, but you can read one of my original takes on it in a post on my Substack. While it is not my present view, I still think it is very possible. Something I did not mention in my Substack post, but I now know, is that Widow has one additional unique feature to her shape, a natural spike in the lower center of her back. It is only visible when she is turned a particular way. Similarly to the gem, this spike does not show up in the Harp Weaver sprite. This might simply be an oversight on Team Cherry's part, or it could be a subtle clue that Widow is not an original Weaver, but one of the Weaver spawn. The second theory about Widow, which is quite popular, is that she was the last Weaver to be faithful to Silk, and that her staking was done by the Weavers. This was my opinion in my first playthrough. The achievement fanatic makes her sound like a devoted follower, and her shadow in the cradle and the line, "of the first, the last," could be interpreted as she was the last faithful to Silk. People also point to her being a thematic contrast to the first sinner, where the first of the first completely abandoned their mother, and the last of the first was the last faithful. However, I very quickly abandoned this theory during my research for a simple reason. It makes no sense. The Weavers were determined to keep the truth about Silk a secret, and keeping a faithful Weaver alive would only mean the secret could get out. In fact, the first sinner is one reason why I reject the idea that she was the last faithful to Silk. When threatened by information that could expose their lies, they destroy the source of that information. The Weavers had no trouble stripping Atla and binding her in a spire, basically burying her alive. Why then, when they were working so hard to create a religion that could hide the truth about their mother, would they leave someone alive who could tell the masses that the Weavers had actually enslaved their mother? She certainly wouldn't have been kept in the cradle. There, she could have disrupted the resonance of the choir below, and any bugs coming to the loom could have heard her singing. The vision we see in the cradle has to be Widow during the haunting. If she were punished by the Weavers, she would have been locked away in a weave nest, far away from where other bugs could potentially hear her. But this raises another set of issues. Widow is left alive after the Citadel is handed over to the threefold government. Why would they keep her alive, even locked up in a weave nest, to potentially escape and aid in the awakening of their mother? Keeping her locked up and isolated certainly is in character with their cruelty, but when looking at the way they handle all other problems they face, it just seems incredibly out of character. They have no problem killing family members. At all. Lastly, rarely, if ever, do revolutions against governments ever include 99% of the population being on board. Oftentimes there are harsh divisions. There may be a majority for the revolution, but the idea that only one person said, "Nah, I'll stay with Mom," feels incredibly unlikely to me. You could argue that there were others who were pinned and that Widow is the only one left, but there's no evidence of that. Not to mention, it would be even riskier than leaving Widow alive. If there were Weavers who remained loyal to Silk, they would have been executed immediately into the uprising, if not weeded out in the lands below before the deed was even attempted. The only piece of evidence that could potentially point to this interpretation being true is that, according to the wiki, the traditional Chinese title for her is Martyr Widow. However, it's hard to know if this was done at Team Cherry's direction, or if it was the translator's interpretation of her character, as the simplified Chinese calls her Black Widow. No other translations add any sort of adjectives to her title. What I believe is more likely is that Widow is the last of the Weavers who created the Citadel. And I also believe it very likely that she was the one who sealed all the other Weavers into spires. She was the last to remain behind and watch over Pharloom. She was the last of the first. This seems to have been her backstory in the original versions of the game. There are cut sprites from a cutscene where Widow, clearly identifiable by the gem on her chest, has her mask removed on a silk siphon by haunted bugs. The sprites are also clearly labeled as Spinner, Widow's name in code. The cut sprites of Widow in the dress match sketches for a Weaver priestess, a cut NPC who may have watched over a Weaver shrine, according to some notes. In Ari's sketchbook, she is drawn beside sketches of a Weaver shrine core creature, who seems to have been an early concept of Eva. Several of the components of the weave nests are labeled Weaver Shrine, making it likely that this version of Widow lived in one of the weave nests, possibly Atla. To connect Widow more with the nest, Atla was the original location of a Weaver Spire from which Hornet bound the Needle-In ability. Piecing it together, it is possible that Widow was originally an NPC who guarded the Weaver graves in Weave Nest Atla. Because she is the last Weaver alive, I think she was supposed to be the one who carried out the burials. This version of Widow, being a lonely priestess who buried the last of her sisters, fits her canon dialogue about spending eternity alone and being the last Weaver. Obviously, her original location and role was changed, and we can't use cut content as confirmation of canon. However, there are certain details of the present lore that makes me suspect that not all of her backstory was completely abandoned. We have 4 current sources of information on Widow: her silk shade in the cradle, her meeting with Hornet, the harp memory, and the interactive memory that precedes it. I want to examine the interactive portion of Widow's memory, as I think it offers us some information that is easily missed. As I mentioned in my video on Pharloom's Lost Kingdoms, memories can change over time. However, someone cannot have a memory about something they do not know about. Widow has a memory of weave nest doors, meaning that she knew about the weave nests and interacted with them. Because of the memory at the end, you could theorize that the gate belonged to the cradle in Era 5, but because we find absolutely no remains of such a gate around the cradle or the Citadel, I think it unlikely. I believe the memory is more probable to be a conglomeration of Widow's experiences than it be her traversing a specific location. Atla's interactive memory also has a similar feel, being a blend of caves, chasms, and other farlids skittering in and out of sight. Widow's memory appears to be a mashup of the cradle and a weave nest, based on the consumed bugs we see at the top and the weavers we glimpse throughout. In the course of the interactive memory, we will see about 4 weavers, though there could possibly be more that I missed. I play on a Switch, which is one reason I can't use mods to look at sprites, so I have to look at things individually and piece things together using screenshots. The weavers are animated using a blank sprite to which the game will randomly assign a set of spikes. This results in a different version of the memory every time you play. It also produces multiples of the same weaver in the same shot. Because of this inconsistency, I don't think that we are supposed to take the number of weavers as canon, but interpret them as a symptom of Widow's shifting and shadowy memory. However, because each weaver has a unique set of spikes at their shoulders and hips, we can identify some of the weavers in this memory. The most notable is Syndril, the weaver who gives Hornet Swift Step. She looks slightly different from her spire because we see her at an angle in the memory. There is also a weaver with 4 spikes down her back who matches the weaver building the snare setter in Weave Nest Atla. I've often wondered if she took over leading the rune experiments in the Weave Nest after Atla rebelled. We don't have a name for her, but she could also be the weaver who gives Hornet Threadstorm, as that weaver has no spikes on its shoulders or hips, but may have some on her back. There's also a weaver with a single curve on her shoulder, who appears to match 2 cut sprites from 2 cut cutscenes. One was the original version of the harp memory, the other was a memory associated with the Needle Inn. In the harp memory, she was a harp player. The final weaver I could find has 3 spikes. It is possible that she is the weaver on the far left of the snare setter, as the spikes look very similar. However, the weaver in the memory only has them on one side, and it is unclear if some of her spikes are hidden due to the angle at which she is standing, or if they simply extend from her back. If they only extend from her back, she could also be the weaver who gives Hornet Threadstorm. So why are these weavers in Widow's memory? Perhaps they were the original musicians who played with Widow in the cradle. They might have also been her friends with whom she worked closely to create the Citadel and defeat their mother. At minimum, the 4-spike weaver gives her a connection to Weave Nest Atla and rune work. Syndril gives her a connection to her weave nest, the plan to evacuate the other weavers, and, potentially, her spire. Could Syndril have been the last weaver to be bound in a spire, and thus left Widow alone? One could argue that Widow was spiked and held prisoner in Weave Nest Atla, and that is certainly possible. However, there is a Widow-shaped hole in the lore that makes me suspect that not all of her cut backstory was completely abandoned. Originally, my main issue with the theory that Widow helped with a rebellion against Silk was the fact that there is a distinct lack of Weaver intervention in the Citadel post the Weavers being bound in spires. I still think this is a bit odd, but the threefold government was made to replace the Weavers in leadership, which is now why I believe why Widow left and never returned. You see, there is another aspect of parallelism regarding the Weavers. Beyond being able to match them to names and roles, many of those roles directly correlate to the government and the running of the Citadel. 2 of them are rather vague. Merglin is very difficult to place because she is very close to saltwater, so she was either only concerned with making weapons and fled with Sindral's aid, or she played a role in the Citadel's work in the Eastern Sea. Weaver Karn is a bit of a puzzle. She may have helped with weapons, but I could see her helping out in other places with her silk skill, potentially helping to manage the Citadel's delivery system. I hope DLC will reveal a bit more about these two. The rest of the Spire Weavers fit pretty easily into the administration of the Citadel. Absalom did some sort of surveillance beyond her studies on Void, as she is the one who had the Farsight. It is also possible that she worked with the Deep Docks, though it is hard to say for certain. The unnamed Weaver who gives Hornet Threadstorm likely oversaw the silk distribution throughout the Citadel, perhaps even managing the loom. I've already said that I believe Camora was the founder of the White Ward, a role that was taken over by the Surgeons. Kilal, the Weaver of the Path, oversaw the pilgrimage and protected pilgrims during their journey. That role, in a physical way, was replaced by the Sentinels, who were made by the very first architect long before the Cogwork Core. Because the first architect also worked on the Cogwork Core, I think that the architect made the Sentinels shortly after Kilal was sealed in a spire to help replace her. Askar likely created the architects. She is found just below them, and her weave nest in Mount Fae studied memory crystals. Something unique about the architects as opposed to other automatons is that they share a memory store located in the chapel of the architect. Thus, it is likely that Askar built the architects to replace her, using the knowledge she had learned from the memory crystals in Mount Fae. Atla was the keeper of the history, though another weaver would have had to take her place after her rebellion. If I were to make a guess, the person who replaced her might have been the four-spiked weaver. The role of historian eventually, however, was replaced by the High Vault Keeper. Which leaves the conductors, the keepers of the music, and the ones who, in their own words, were to guide the land ever on to greatness. The weaver who I believe held this role, or at least one of them, was Widow. From the moment we meet her, Widow is tied to music. She is playing the strands of silk tied to the bell, and Hornet's entry on her says that, despite the silk being pinned into her shell, she can control silk through music. She gives Hornet the needle in, and we know that she was one of Silk's original musicians. I think it is quite possible that she was the one who oversaw the song that kept her mother asleep. In fact, in the cut sprites of her getting her mask removed, her dress is wide and flowing, unlike the clothes of the other weavers. That dress is sort of similar to what the conductors wear, though on a thinner body. Again, it is cut content, so it can't be used to confirm, but it's interesting to note. One of the larger mysteries about Silksong and its music is whether or not certain music is meant to keep Silk asleep, and what music may be used to awaken her. I'll talk more about it when I reach Era 7, but if we look at the music and sounds we know the Weavers created to keep Silk asleep, we can hear what is called the DS array. It appears throughout the music of the game, and if you look it up, you can find a ton of analysis on it from people who understand music way better than I do. It's probably most recognizable in Silk's theme song, Awakening. The motif is often used in musical pieces to represent death. Despite being associated with Silk's awakening, within the Citadel it was used for the opposite. It was used as the music of the bells in the bell shrines and the bells in the Grand Gate. Both were created by the Weavers, so I think it likely that it was intended to keep Silk asleep. But the motif also shows up in two other places relevant to Silk's slumber. Lace hums it when conducting the silk flies in the Deep Docks. While she certainly wants the attention and affection of her mother, It is undeniable that Lace has a very unstable relationship with her, crying out for attention one moment and 5 minutes later chopping off her arm to send her into the void. I think that there is a reason why Silk has remained asleep for so long, even though Lace has been walking the Citadel for years, supposedly to wish her waking. The other place where it shows up is in Widow's harp music before Hornet challenges her. At first, when I was listening to her harp music, I thought she might be playing the choral chambers. But since I am terrible at picking out pieces of music, I asked my viewers for some help. YouTube was rotten and deleted who knows how many of their comments, but some people managed to comment and tell me that Widow is actually playing the dies irae. This is fascinating because, if she is supposed to be an ally of Silk, she is playing the same song the Weavers used to keep her asleep, the same song being repressed by the silk wrapped around the bell. Not only that, the Needle-In song that Hornet learns from Widow also features the dies irae. This makes me highly suspicious of the idea that Widow is a willful martyr for Silk. Remember, her silk is stuffed in her shell, and her mask is removed, making her mental state questionable, and also leaving her vulnerable to Silk's sway. We can't see it without mods, but Widow does respond to the Needle-In, revealing that she is haunted just like the many other bugs in Pharloom. I think it more likely that she was martyred for being the original Conductor and leading the main religion and maybe even rebellion against Silk. While called fanatic in the achievement, the origin of the word fanatic, according to various dictionaries I searched, came from an adjective that described behavior that might result from possession by a god or demon. It quite accurately describes Widow's current physical and mental state, especially under the influence of the haunting. Lastly, the fact that she, even in madness, plays the same song her sisters made to trap Silk, gives that song to Hornet through binding, which Hornet will then use to trigger the snare on Silk, hints that Widow might not be as faithful to Silk as she says or acts. There is a chance that, despite what has been done to her, her subconscious is fighting back. As my final defense for Widow being the last of the Weavers who rebelled, when we consider that the Weavers left Hornet with ancestral arts to reach and battle Silk, it seems strange that they wouldn't want to give her a musical skill to get into the weave nests. Again, it seems to me if Widow had rebelled against them, before they went into slumber they might have sealed her in a spire for a savior's future use. To me, it makes more sense that Widow remained behind as a guide to aid the future savior, but was captured by Silk and punished. Who knows? Perhaps removing Widow's mask was a way for Silk to access her mind and learn about the Weaver's plan to raise up someone to fight her. This may be one reason why she sought to capture the Weaver spawn and converted them into silk flies. While most people like to pair Widow and the First Sinner as sorts of opposites as the most faithful to Silk and the least so, I think that this possible backstory for Widow has its own interesting implications. When we consider that Atla was probably imprisoned in the cradle by her sisters, it is very likely that Widow helped to imprison Atla. Considering her possible role as the Citadel's musician or conductor, it leads me to think that she had a fairly powerful role among her early sisters, especially after Atla was sealed away. If Widow was indeed captured by the haunted bugs, pinned and stripped of her mask, it would be events repeating themselves. Widow would be receiving the same punishment she placed upon Atla, for a similar crime of rebelling against a religious order. This is a repeating theme throughout Silksong. Characters mistreat others to get what they want, and what they sought ends up bringing a similar end on them. This is probably most obvious with Silk and Conductor Mizzello, but there are other examples throughout the game. If we take the translation Martyr Widow and pair it with the First Sinner, It reveals a distinct parallel between the two sisters. Under the religion of the Citadel, which is technically still the ruling religion of Pharloom at the time of the game, Atla is the religion's first heretic. Widow is the Citadel's first martyr. While this is currently where I stand, I am more than willing to admit that Widow could possibly be the last weaver faithful to Silk. When I look at her Needle-In dialogue, she has only adoration for her mother. Most bugs seem to have maintained their last thoughts despite Silk's haunting, though there are some pretty clear instances, such as the cluster in the cradle, of haunted bugs gushing adoration for someone they had no idea existed before they were taken by Silk. So her thoughts being rewritten is more than possible. Ultimately, this theory may just be based on leftovers of an earlier version of Widow. I still say her being left alive makes no sense given the Weaver's track record, but judging by the amount of cut content, it may be that Team Cherry changed her fairly late into development and didn't do much to touch up the story around her. I have no doubt that DLC will help to clarify her backstory. Even if my theory about her being an early Conductor is not true, I still hold to the idea that the threefold government was designed to replace specific weavers who stayed behind, and that 1 or 3 weavers served as the city's original conductors. When we look back on the legacy of the weavers, their story is marred by merciless exploitation, apathetic manipulation, and self-indulgence. Not even their mother or dissenting sister were exempt from their brutal reign. But there is none who exploited their mother's servitude more than Camora, who made Silk the substance necessary for the preservation of the Citadel and paved the way for the doom to come. But even in those early days, outside the Citadel, Silk was not a boon. It was a token of death and destruction, the refuse of silken gods who cared little for the bugs whose homeland they squandered. And those whom they harmed were bound to remember them. And that wraps up the first part of the Reign of the Weavers. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed it, remember to smash that like button like a judge, and subscribe to catch the rest of the series. Also consider sharing it with other Silk Song fans you might meet online. I believe that personal interactions are a great way to get around algorithms and find good content. If you found this interesting, I'd be honored if you shared it. What do you think of the Weavers so far? Do you agree with my timeline? Where do you differ? And what do you make of Widow? Be nice in the comments. But really, I really do enjoy reading all of your comments and discussing things with you. I may not be able to respond to all of you, but just know that I am so thankful and I really enjoy all the time I get to spend with you guys. Thank you again for watching and visiting the Aether Vivarium.